Hello, and welcome to episode 16 of A Week in Watches, which is a weekly look back at cool stories, releases, and news from this wonderful world of watches that we are a part of. I'm your host, Zach Weiss, co-founder of Worn & Wound. Thanks for joining me. This week we have some pretty cool stuff. We have some carbon fiber watches. We have some perpetual chronographs, some things that I'm pretty excited for, so sit tight. Before we get to it, if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing this video, it goes a long way. If you happen to be listening to this on podcast form, give us a review, give us some stars. 5 would be great, but it's up to you. Also, please don't forget to send us your questions. We'd love to take more questions on future episodes from the audience. If you'd like to leave us a question, you can do it in the comments below or email those to info@wornandwound.com. Okay, before we get to it, we do have a sponsor today, and it is just the Wind Up Watch Shop. Well, not just the Wind Up Watch Shop, it's Wind Up Watch Shop, where you can find over 20 different watch brands, tons of different straps, toolboxes, cases, EDC, all sorts of wonderful stuff. Head to windupwatchshop.com now to check that out. Okay, for our first story, Norqain goes feral with the wild one. So a few months ago, actually the very first episode of A Week in Watches, we mentioned that Jean-Claude Biver joined the board of Norqain, which is no small deal because Jean-Claude Biver is himself quite a big deal. And now we know kind of what that conversation might have gone like. So I think it probably went something like this. But this is entirely just me inventing it. I just want to say one word to you. Just one word. And they're like, okay, what's that? Are you listening? Yeah, they're listening. That's what they said. Plastics. Okay. A few of you out there might get the reference. That's from the 1967 film The Graduate. But it does have some relevance to this release because we have seen the Wild One watches, which were announced this week by Norqain. And these are high-performance sports watches that are made out of a new proprietary material called Nortec. This is a carbon fiber composite that is, unto itself not uncommon to see carbon fiber composites at this point, and various brands have their own mixtures and they tend to put names on them. They claim that theirs is more resilient, more flexible, basically the best version of carbon fiber out there, of course. But there is one feature that is certainly unique, and that it can be colored. So often carbon fiber composites, forged carbon sometimes called, are black. I mean, most of the times they are black. When they become more colorful, they tend to have like glass in them, and they become fiberglass. You don't even see that even that often. It's just typically straight black. So they've been able to pigment this in some way to a pretty cool effect. Additionally, it's carbon fiber, so it's super light, 6 times lighter than steel, 3.5 times lighter than titanium, and it's really built to be sporty and active. So these watches were tested to 5,000 Gs and survived that testing. But it's not just this material that adds to that. So the construction of the watch itself, it's a several part construction. There's a exploded diagram we might be able to throw up around here that shows that in addition to a bezel, a midcase, a case back, there is an inner titanium core which holds the movement. And this is Norqain, so they're using their higher end Kinesi movement, which is called the NN20-1. It's a 70-hour movement that is chronometer rated. And in case you're unfamiliar, Kinesi is the movement brand that was actually founded by Tudor and is now making movements for various other brands, Fortis, Norqain, obviously, Chanel, Breitling, perhaps a few others at this point. So it's a high-end watch movement manufacturer. So that whole titanium capsule is then mounted within a rubber ring, and that rubber ring is essentially sandwiched within this case, providing shock absorption. So their goal with this watch was to really make something for active lifestyles and for very sporty people. That is how they're sort of pitching it. It is a rugged sport watch that is also very lightweight. Additionally, it has a 200-meter water resistance, and it's a fairly sizable watch at that as well, coming in at 42 by 49.4 by 12.3 millimeters, so not too thick, but thick, with a 22 millimeter lug width. You'll notice when you look at it, there's a bit of a flange on the side, and I'm not sure if the 42 millimeters is to the bezel or out to that side flange. That's something we'll have to confirm at a later date. At launch, there are 4 versions to pick from. So there's 2 versions that are open, so not limited, and those are black and khaki, but that's khaki in the kind of British sense of it, so it's like an olive green, and black and blue. These feature a dial that has this kind of interesting lattice work of laser cut layers, don't say that fast, that sort of looks like an ice crystal to me, to my eyes, but it's actually created out of the Norqain N logo, which you'll see at the top of their watches, this little double N logo, which is meant to be visually associated with mountains, but it is still just a lot of the Norqain logo, essentially. So these two versions come in at $5,290. So then there's also two limited editions. One is in burgundy and gray, and this is edition of 200. This is really where you can see how the color can really start to come out in this new Nortec material. There really isn't black on the case from what I can tell. And the burgundy and the gray, burgundy, which I'd almost say looks a little bit more like a raspberry sorbet sort of a color, looks really nice. And I could see how other colors, oranges and different greens and blues could be, you know, pretty cool in the future. This one comes in at $5,690, so that is $400 over the open models. So there's one more limited edition, which is called the Hakuna Mipaka, not to be confused with another Hakuna you might be thinking of, which is the animal sanctuary that is founded by brand ambassador Dean Schneider. So this is an animal sanctuary that is in, I believe, South Africa that Dean Schneider has founded. And the watch then pulls sort of from his work with animals. So you'll find the dial and the strap have a lion fur texture on it, which actually looks awesome. It's not like printed with all the colors of a lion. It's just a black texture that has just a nice sort of randomness to it. And the case is black and sort of a tan color, but that tan plastic has been mixed with sand from this oasis that he has created. So there's apparently more of like a sort of a speckled texture to it. It's a little hard to see in photos. 10% of the proceeds of this watch will go to that sanctuary, and it costs $5,590. So what do you guys think of this? What do you think of the direction that Jean-Claude Biver has taken Norqain? Is this going to turn them into, you know, the big Swiss sports watch of the future? Let us know what you think. Next, Vulcain keeps buzzing. So Vulcain is a Swiss watch brand that you likely might be familiar with if you've been, looking into watches for a little while. They've been around since 1858, so certainly a long time. They're famous for having invented, or at least perfected, the alarm complication with their watch line, which you most likely are familiar with, called the Cricket. It's a very cool series of watches that have been around, since the mid-20th century. You'll see they almost look like GMTs because they have a fourth hand, which is for setting when the alarm will go off. They have two barrels in them, one for the watch, one for the buzzer effect, and they wind both ways, so you can wind both springs. They're really cool little watches, and of course, when they go off, they have a quite audible buzz, like a cricket. But crickets don't buzz. This is something I was kind of thinking about when I was writing this. They chirp, right? Crickets chirp, bees buzz. Anyway, the name's been around for a while, so I won't argue with it. It's called the Cricket, and they're pretty famous. They were worn by presidents. U.S. presidents. They were given to them at times, starting with Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon, Johnson, and others had Cricket watches. It is something that is associated with the brand. The vintage watches are pretty widely available, and they're actually really great vintage watches to look into because they're fairly affordable in terms of vintage watches. You can pick up a nice Cricket for a couple grand, and they just look like classic mid-century kind of casual or dress watches. The brand has sort of changed hand a few times over the years. Back in 2005, they went upmarket quite dramatically, creating watches such as the Imperial Gong, which was a tourbillon with an alarm complication. I believe the only watch to have ever had both a tourbillon and an alarm complication. And with that move, obviously the prices got quite a bit higher. They sort of fizzled out a little bit after that. I believe at least they weren't available in the US, but now they are back after a hiatus. And now that they are back, they're sort of staying truer to what the brand originally was, which I would say was more of a watch for everyone. There's something very practical about an alarm watch, so it should be available and fairly accessible. With their new launch, they're definitely focusing on that sort of back catalog of iconic designs, so they have a clear sort of mid-century or vintage look. Like I said, they're sort of just more accessible in all ways. So they've launched, obviously, with the Cricket. So there's two families to start, the Classique and the Tradition. The Classique is a little bit more 30s, and the Tradition is a little bit more 50s. The Classique has lume, whereas the Tradition has applied markers. No matter how you look at it, they're actually both quite classical and quite traditional, so the names don't necessarily describe them all too well, but they look straight out of a vintage catalog. They both come in 36 and 39 millimeter sizes and in 4 colors. So at launch, they actually have 16 different watches, and that's not even counting the strap options. So there's black dials, there's white dials, there's different colors of lume, and then there's also limited editions within those groups of salmon dials, each limited to 50. So that's 50 at 36, 50 at 39 across 2 things. So that's 4 limited editions. It's quite complicated, but if you go check out the website, you'll figure it out pretty quickly. But what's most important about these is that they obviously have the cricket movement, and this is a manufacturer Swiss movement that is made by the same company, Vulcain, that has been making them all along. So the caliber in them is called the V10. It's a manual wound caliber with an 18,000 beat per hour frequency, a 52-hour power reserve, and when it's fully wound, it'll buzz for 20 seconds for the alarm, which is a substantial amount of buzz. And it's, of course, Swiss made. So the new Vulcain crickets come in at a fairly approachable price, though, they're not super inexpensive either. They come in at 3,600 Swiss francs, or a little bit over 3,700 USD. And the 39 millimeter version comes in at 3,900 Swiss francs, or a little over $4,000 USD. So the thing I think to kind of keep in mind here is that alarm watches are quite rare on the market. There's really only one other brand that is known for making them, Jaeger-LeCoultre, or Jaeger-LeCoultre, I should probably say, with their Memovox, and those start closer to $13,000. So for a contemporary alarm watch for the manufacturer movement, these are really quite reasonable. Fairer goes farther with 3 new barrel case design watches. Back in April of this year, Fairer announced the Stanhope 2. They actually did so at Wind Up Watch Fair San Francisco. The Stanhope one was part of their only series of manual wound watches that weren't chronographs, and they were kind of like fun little sporty cushion case watches. They used the Pizu 7001 movement, and that line got retired some time ago. But the Stanhope was just a very popular watch. It had a black and white dial with a sort of a clou de Paris sort of pattern on it, applied numerals. It was a nice mix of some sporty and dressy elements. So there's clearly a demand for Fairer to bring them back. And they did so, but with a new case. So they launched it back in April in a 30.85 cushion case that has sort of an Art Deco design to it. The original version was maybe a little bit more 50s, 60s, and this felt, to me at least, a little bit more 30s in its look. And it had what Paul Sweetenham of Fairer commonly referred to as bat ear lugs, which were just nice little kind of short lugs that, looked really nice. It was a very svelte case. It's fully polished, had a really beautiful profile, or sort of bowed out in this organic way. Very attractive watch. Fairer doesn't usually develop a case and then only put one watch in it, and now we see what they did to follow that up. And they've launched a new trilogy of watches, all hand wound and all inspired by female British explorers, which each of the watches are named after. First up is the Durham, named after Mary Edith Durham, a British explorer, artist, and anthropologist. This one has a 2-tone dial in slate and salmon with Roman numerals, and I'll just get this out of the way. It's my favorite of the bunch. There's something about it that really reminds me of sort of early Rolex bubble backs, which I think are sort of poised for a comeback, but don't quote me on that. Next is the Lethbridge, and I am going to screw this up, which is named after Lady Hay Drummond Hay, whose name was formerly Lethbridge. So take that as you will. She was a journalist and an explorer, the first woman to travel around the world by air, which I believe was actually done on a Zeppelin, which actually, come to think of it, the case sort of has something Zeppelin-esque about it. This one is a silver sector dial with blue accents for the numerals and hands. It's definitely a little bit more stripped down, and having not seen it in person yet, I'm curious how the metal of the dial looks compared to the case. This might have that really sort of nice monochromatic style to it. Either way, it's more subtle and subdued. Next up is the Mansfield, named after Charlotte Mansfield, a novelist and explorer. This one is also a sector dial, sort of similar to the Lethbridge, but it's in a light green color and has silver accents, and has also a different style of indices. So the Lethbridge had a full numeral indice, and this one alternates between batons. So 3 definitely distinct looking watches. All are powered by the manual wound Sellita SW216, which features a sub-seconds at 6. These watches are available now to order for $9.95, and they will begin shipping in mid-October. It seems actually like quite a great value. These are very elegant watches. I'd say, they're most formal watches that Fair has produced, and it made me wonder, do you think it's time that there's going to be a comeback for dress watches? I'm starting to think that we're heading that direction. And now we have the release of the week, perpetually Habring 2. So Habring 2 is like this, I feel like, insider independent brand. They are certainly marched to the beat of their own drum. Their website is, shows their watches, but it doesn't have prices. It's a little bit hard to indicate or hard to tell like how exactly you order their watches, yet it's very hard to be anything but very fond of what they produce. They make, beautiful watches with in-house movements that are fairly affordable, and as you'll see, though the watch we're talking about today is more expensive, many of their watches are under 10K, despite really being like small batch, bespokely made watches. So it's a brand that was founded by Richard Habring and his spouse Maria Christina. And Richard Habring is a famed watchmaker who worked in the 90s for IWC and developed their Doppelchronograph, which is German for Rattrapant, which is French for split seconds. So this is, a fantastic complication that is notoriously complex and, not a lot of brands make. So he developed that, and he's just known as sort of a watchmaking whiz. Within their collection, they have many different chronographs which sort of show off that passion. There's mono pushers, there's central minute chronographs, there's Doppel chronographs as well. Perhaps most interesting and most unique is a chronograph that has no pushers at all, but the start, stop, and reset are controlled by turning the crown itself. So they're certainly the only people with that. But then they also have plenty of 3-hand watches as well in their Felix and Irwin lines. These often have dead stop seconds, or jumping seconds as they might be called, which is a very curious complication because it makes your mechanical watch almost seem like a quartz watch, but there's a certain fondness for this, I'd say, in like independent collecting circles. They also have something called a flashing seconds, which is like a sub-second dial, but it spins around at the rate of the movement itself. So 8 times per second. So it's called flashing seconds. It's just like dancing around the dial. It's kind of funky. They're also known for being very customizable. It's sort of the kind of thing where you order the watch you want. These are super rare. I've only seen a handful in person, in the last decade. But anyway, today what we're talking about is their newest release, which is the Chrono Felix Perpetual. So as I mentioned before, there's a line called Felix, and on their non-chronograph watches, it's sort of their entry-level line, but they do have versions of these that are chronographs, and these are powered by an in-house movement called the A11CP, which is, I believe, based on the Valjoux 7750 in terms of its design, but it's entirely made in-house. It even uses like a Carl Haas hairspring, and it's hand-finished as well. Very well-regarded movement. In order to get the perpetual calendar functions, however, they used a Dubois de Pras module, which is also extremely well regarded. This is a module that's been used by like major Swiss brands, major Swiss luxury brands before. So it's a way of essentially getting around developing that all in-house, but it's still a very, very high-end, component. So perpetual calendars are rare. Perpetual calendar chronographs are even rarer. They're almost impossible to find. Perpetual monopusher chronographs, however, are rarer even still. And if you do a little searching, you're likely to only find like a couple of Pateks that all cost $500,000. By the way, did I mention that the Chrono Felix Perpetual is also a monopusher? So this is just a really exceptional watch, super rare kind of complication, the kind of thing you just don't see very often. And like I said, typically found on watches that cost $500,000, which, wink, wink, I'm getting there. This one doesn't. This isn't, however, the first perpetual calendar chronograph that Habring has made. Back a few years ago, they released a Doppel Perpetual, which is actually even more complicated because it's a split-second chronograph as well as a perpetual calendar. And while an absolutely beautiful and envious watch, there's one feature or detail of it which, made me, not that I'm actually shopping for these, always wish that there was a different version, and that's that it was 43 millimeters, kind of large. Well, the new Chronofelix Perpetual is 38.5 millimeters, which is just perfect. So just once again, reiterate, this is a mono-pusher perpetual calendar chronograph that's 38.5 millimeters made by an independent brand. So clearly it must cost $1 billion. But no, these are $25K. Still can't buy it, but I can imagine buying it, right? Like I can imagine flipping all my watches and maybe half a kidney and then getting this watch for $25K. A Patek at $500,000, I'm afraid that one's just vaporware. So at launch, it appears that there are two versions of this watch. One is a salmon dial with sort of a minimal style to the sub-dials and silvered brigade numerals, and this says Habring on the dial. This appears to be their mainline version. It's just absolutely gorgeous. Once again, at that size and given the complexity of it, I think it would just be completely, beautiful on the wrist. But given how that brand works, I don't know. It's very possible that these are going to be made sort of to the bespoke desires of the actual customers. TBD on the actual ordering process on these. So if you are interested, you're going to have to look into that yourself, I'm afraid. But there was a second version that was a little bit clearer in the ordering process because Habring teamed up with Massena Lab for a limited edition at launch. So Massena Lab is the eponymous brand of William Massena, who's a watch industry veteran. He worked for Antiquorum. He's been a time zone moderator. He's been a Worn Around podcast guest as well. But he's been, around the watch industry for decades now, and he's very well known, particularly like in watch collecting circles. His brand Massena Lab, which he founded several years ago, has focused on collaborations with brands such as Unimatic and Ming. Recently, they did a Louis Aurard, and he's actually done several with Habring too, including this new perpetual chronograph. Additionally, he's also made sort of high-end homages such as the Uni Racer, which are not collaborations and are sort of a passion project underneath the Massena Lab name. For this collaboration, he was inspired by the Patek 1518, which is the first perpetual chronograph, which was launched in the 1940s. Interesting side note, I learned if you search 1518 and forget to put Patek in front of it, you get stories of the dance epidemic of 1518 from Strasbourg, France, which is a city in the Alsace region of France where people danced to death in the summer of 1518. Go figure. The Massena Lab limited edition is black and silver and has a very kind of classic, early 20th century look to it. You can definitely see the Patek inspiration. One feature that is particularly neat is that the moon phase has been inverted, so it has like a black moon and black stars on a silver background, which to my eye just looks really fantastic. There's 20 of these watches. They went on sale earlier this week, and I'm afraid to tell you they appear to have already sold out. So if you want one of these, you're going to have to be looking for it on eBay sometime in the future. 10 of these watches will be delivered next year and another 10 in 2024. So once again, this is, not an inexpensive watch. And as I sort of explained, it's sort of a bespoke thing. It's not the easiest thing to get. But at $25K for a mono pusher chronograph, this is just the kind of thing that watch dreams are made of. And that's our episode for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to head to wornaround.com daily for more news and reviews. And please come back next week. I'll see you then.